Well, on the agenda, I stand for the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America,
and to the republic
which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First item on the agenda, continuous school improvement directive. A is directive training regarding county program. Proceed to conduct training provided by Hiram O'Call, West Virginia School Board Association interim executive director, and Jason Long, counsel for the Buckley County Board of Education. Money from West Virginia County. Mr. O'Call.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. You have one of the most beautiful settings for Christian homes that I have seen. It really is nice. And it's such a beautiful drive here. As Mr. Bryan pointed out, this is a directive training and it is regarding to the subjects that he listed out. What I did was, in order to get ready for this meeting, I think I put together a little case study. And it goes into the protocols, procedures, and it also gets into an individual board member content. If you read this, and I know it's a lot of people have a lot of job, employment and everything, but this actually relates to an individual who literally hit the ground running when he was elected. First thing he did, we get in, and I'm going to give an overview here. Then we'll get into parliamentary procedure, an open meetings law, and Jason will speak after that and give the legal context, and I'll give less context from understanding school boards and school board operation. Well, anyway, this guy named Elijah Newcomber, he had lived, actually he moved out of state and he retired as CFO of a company that's located in the Triangle area, Raleigh, Chapel Hill Triangle area of North Carolina. And he came back home, retired early, and so he decided to run for the school. And during a forum, he basically said that school board, county board must ensure school district maintains its high academic standing in the state despite our big group. So he was saying, this is what we've got to concentrate. We've got to check and see that our academic standing, even though we're a rural county, is maintained. And then board president, who are now there's 4 people running for election. There are 2 incumbents and 2 challengers. One member decided not to run for re-election. His name is Smith. He decided he did not want to run for re-election. So there's 3. There's a majority of the board that happens every 4 years. So the first thing the board president was saying during the forum is that that a county board has a lot of other duties to decide, a lot of other duties. And what he was really saying is we have to be aware that because of how formula works and funds our schools, we may be moving into a new reality. So he's just being very, initially, he's just trying to explain, we may have to close schools. What he said, well, there's only one school they can close, we'll get into in a moment. So a reporter then began to ask, well, do you really need consolidation? He finally says we cannot rule that. So in other words, he, as board president, is bringing this to the public, that this is something the board can have pride as they go down the road, as they go, move down the process. And then Newcomer, and he's all over the place. He said, well, school boards rise to challenges, especially looking at innovation. So his deal is innovation. And what he says here is that innovation, he called it something that's unconventional but realistic. That's what he called innovation. So his whole deal here is to be coming on board to bring the idea of innovation to the county board. Well, as we move through the debate or forum, then the president says, page 2 here, line 30, says, well, you're losing the forum when you get into things like innovation. This is something the board member or the public may not fully understand. And he says, a board's work often comes down to what's required rather than a bunch of make this, make that. And then he went on to say, now another board member, another incumbent, she comes in and says, sometimes complying or compliance means ends up being the only approach given laws and regulations we struggle with. And then, Fieldstone, one of the other people who's running, she also retired, came back to county. And then she said that we really don't know why she's running, but we do find out she wants to run the county commission. So she's getting her campaign started. She doesn't make it. And I don't think she's very upset. And then she goes off on her tangent here talking. Now, she works in a place in Ohio, or near Pickering, Ohio, outside Columbus. It's just acres and acres of distribution warehouses. So that's where she works. And so we get into that first and gives her a comment on that. But somehow she gets into extraction industries. Has nothing to do with any of this. And then, again, first says the economy must improve. She says education is the only cost for attracting every high-tech, alternate energy businesses and small businesses, big box warehouse. She's directly related to this lady, don't cut. Okay. Then it goes on, and Thurston says, now he goes into the litany of superintendents they had. Now we don't know who was before Roy Casey at the back. We do not know who was before. But anyway, he was kind of a native son. He is someone like someone who's a native son who gets to be principal of Capital High School, or some big principal in the state. Some really big school, waiting for something like that. And then he decides he wants to come back to the county too as county superintendent. Well, he had experience in a principalship, and when he came back to the county, he didn't really make the transition from the small amount of accountability, and it's not small in the sense that it's not important, but the smaller amount of accountability you get when you work with a school community, rather than all the cross pressures you get when you become a county board member or superintendent. Everybody wants to be you, particularly the superintendent. He's the CEO of the county board, he's the CEO of the county board, and also by state law or policy, the school district's chief instructional leader. So he never really made the switch, and he read between the lines here. He just he was really eating up ego. Okay, that's basically how. So it eaten up so badly that he got rid of Mr. Clanton, who was the treasurer, who was beginning to say, we've got to pay attention to this because we're maybe in financial difficulty because of declining enrollment. And he ran it off because he very bad news. He doesn't positive. Very bad. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, then it moves on a little bit. And then after they talk about this, then the superintendent in the middle here, her name is Dr. Sophia Patrice Block. Now, we learned in the very end of this, she paid education late. She's like a printer that starts out in the profession and becomes tax. She came late to calling. And she brought different sense of things, and they really liked her. And we don't, my wife, she said, she said, I'm going to the superintendent, I'll ask her. Well, I'll get a program, we'll do a program in a moment. So she actually introduced the board to what's called monitoring and oversight. Now, 18.5.14, school policies for school practice actually gets into that concept. And she kind of dumbed down those big words. You really need to keep tabs on the system by getting data and monitoring that you ask for, so you're not caught surprises. In other words, physical data. Now, I recommend the Rum County Board the other day about his policies from Jason Butcher. You're in this region here. One of the things that boards often get, and it's not a criticism because it's really part of the state policy. You get a lot of data at meetings, but do you ever have your superintendent say to you quarterly, here's where we stand, here's what may happen, here's the big rocks we may run into. So that's kind of an example of data and mom. It could be for other things, academics, it could be professional ed, it could be for leadership, like principals and others. So she kind of introduced into that concept, and they like her. Then they go to say, well, we like it, but it's kind of hard to explain to the public. In fact, president said, we had to really realign our agendas because we had to fit in athletics, complain about cheerleaders and all that kind of thing. But we did it because, first of all, we got a hold of our attendance and we spent time in each meeting for the public to know, and us to know about things from remote. That's what we're preaching. And then this Mr. Luke comes back, he comes back and he says, really, monitoring oversight is a really good idea, but it can often become a work into itself. He says it's about school being plain spoken and transparency. And then he gives an example. He said, you know, when I was a kid in high school, we didn't have HVAC, the air conditioning thing that's never worked. We didn't work on it for 15 years and fix it. It cost the public much more than if we had been attending to it. So that's sort of his response to all this, you know. But then he comes around, when we get into participation, he comes around and he is really one of the old cycles. He's one of these people that they're able to just catch what's in the environment to make it to really exploit and release it. So he really knows that this is the way to really give this world some fire. And then a mom who said, well, you know, it really proved that all you have to do is deal with these rules and laws and regulations. And newcomer quickly said, regulation, strangulation, kills them. So he really moved into where he eventually lands here. But the board president is a wise man. He's been on the board maybe as a third term. He said it's very important. I concur in principle, but it's far more complex. So in other words, he's laying out the reality of it, where this guy Elijah, he's just getting in both things. So eventually, we won't go through all this now. They talk about the primary election. His dad apparently had people, the polls and all that sort of thing in this part of the county. His mom in another part of the county. Here's what he said about school. This area of the county now, they really decide partisan elections because the county's kind of split. So they're maybe whatever anyone they may be elected commissioner every 4 years. The person that would elect the director, he's in a direct situation. She is, they don't have any clout for elect. But then he pointed out school boards that school board members elected from Maui with a Maui constituency, they have a lot of clout. You're 1 of 5 people. And you have to look at the whole district, is what he's really saying here. And then his dad went on to say some other things that are purely philosophical. He said, and I'd like to read these people. Sometimes we kind of forget this. School board members are elected on name recognition, basically. They're not elected like everybody was worried that Jefferson, Berkeley County, give things are close to DC, come like Congress. Because board members are people elected that the public puts trust in. They maybe don't know what board members do. They certainly don't, I think, sometimes. They don't know all the rules, regulations, and things. But he goes on to say, vote for Jack, and he's kind of making fun of his son. He said, for Jack, that's a big word. He calls him lives. That's his nickname. He said, they're whims, hoping board members can achieve something done, undone, or even unrealized within the school system. So in other words, now a lot of people don't vote for board members in the election. Board members used to say people like legislators and like us. That's really not true. Some people only vote for legislators or others and vote for board members. I've never known anyone who just voted for board members, but maybe there is. So in other words, he's saying here that what you're really talking about doesn't have anything to do with that. It's a transaction that people make when they vote with the board member and the board gets something done. Now, they will know it at the close of schools. They'll know that that's not something they want. But in other words, that's what he's saying. So he does win re-election, or he does win election. And in the first state, they have a newspaper. It's called the B. And there's an old guy who will clock the wax column. He said the board election was predictable. Mr. Innovation, what's next? Because he knows that they're going to be going down a path here. Now, we'll get into some of these other things in a moment. As we go through these things that are after page 4, we get into parliamentary procedure. We get into meetings law. We get into what you can and cannot do at meetings. And then we see a shift in the board. They didn't really like the innovation thing, but then when they realized they had to close out school, that suddenly they all began to talk privately about this as political suicide. So then when they got into that aspect of it, they actually said, well, we don't vote with you, and we don't like some of your ideas. So they directed the superintendent to kind of figure out if there were options to not close the school. Well, superintendent, now this superintendent, the third one we're talking about, his name is Pritchard. And he is really matter of fact. He's not theoretical. He's not like a Waller. And he's not egotistical. It's just theoretical. It's like this. Well, he really, that's kind of his position. It's like this. You may not want to be, but it's like this. But then he realizes too that it's going in this direction. He could read the tea leaves. They're moving in this direction. He said, hey, it's not part of the CEFP. We'll do these studies. It's going to be academic, but we'll do tie up my staff time. We'll do them anyway. And then suddenly, he says, well, we probably have another year before we have to make a decision. It didn't turn out. In fact, we had to make a decision quickly. And this was written abruptly. The way I wrote it was abruptly because Elijah's dad said everything works well if something happens out in the environment that impresses on the school system, and then people have to make a quick decision. So during the process of trying to figure out what they might do about school, Elijah went to the LSIC chair. He went outside his walls for a minute. As a member of the board decided he'd go to the LSIC chair and set up this big thing where they could get $2 billion. And he had friends in the research triangle and said, we'll give you $1 million, raise $500,000, get $500,000 more. And they wanted to adapt the micro school concept for private schooling, choice schooling into a public school concept. Well, the superintendent, he just shook his head. This is not in CEFP. It won't fly. Charleston will like this. I don't even know if we can do it. You might have the money and how we spend it. Who's liable for it? All these things are through his head like they would. But then he does, they begin to put all these things together. And it comes back to her name is Pia. She comes by and says, well, it is doable, and we think we might have legislation. Well, you can just see the superintendent thinking, okay, now we might have a school, say, if it's anyone we have. We don't even, this probably can't even happen anyway, but she realizes that LSIC can wait. So what she does is she kind of takes that idea but in the end, of course, nothing saves the school. So now this guy has been Mr. Innovation, but he was a former CFO, former financial officer for a big company. So he takes it upon himself to go to his space support and says, guys, we have to close the school. I'm sorry, it's all for financial reasons. So the last thing right here, kind of pivotal, is they thought they had him in their pocket. He thought they had him, So he says, you're selling us out. You're voter conscious man, joined by voter conscious shouts around the country. In other words, rather than the entire breaking news, he who was put in by election by this group, then he goes and breaks the news. Now, I guess he got out okay. I don't know, but I guess he got out okay. So this is the scenario, and it's really a lot about when you first get elected to the board. You go to orientation and get paid for everything. I mean, you're literally told the first handout that I got the last orientation was you could be removed from office. Well, that's not a very good way to start something, is it? Okay. I don't know if you all remember that, but this is sort of how you start. Rather than saying these are potential things you could do, it starts out with all the things you can't do, and it never really ends because all you can't. So we may need to change that, when we go to 26 orientation. But the superintendent makes a really good point here. Is there a lot of good return on investment if we put our study and time into this? Are we really going to get anything out of this? You know, these alternate ideas and things like that. And so when I worked on those policies for JC Ford, they had the concept that if a law or a state board policy suffices, why don't you put all that in your policy manual, just follow it, which is what the legislature being. Legislature is saying agencies, if we have a law, why do you write a policy about it when the law speaks for itself? State board is not included in that group of people because the legislature often directs state board to write a rule. That is mine, like this that's coming out of it. So now let's go through, turn the page, and let's start on the, let's go to page, 4. That is line, line 1. This is where they have a organization. And of course, it's contradictory. First, reelected as president, first and reelected as vice president, and they begin to things. Now, the agenda not only had election of officers who would sort of break all sort of thing, but it had an item to determine an agenda goal setting work session. So, in other words, they were going to have a goal setting work session. And so, our president, bring your goals, whatever you think we should do. Well, the superintendent said goals are by schools and the school district, and that's their responsibility. We usually determine county superintendent evaluation goals. The board cannot carve out its own goals. Well, that's, in my opinion, not, and Jason may want to comment on this. That's really not true. You can have your own goals. They do not have to be board superintendent goals that you have to provide. If you feel like you need to do an extra half and looking at student achievement, that can be a goal. It's as long as you, the statutory thing is to develop the, and you have nothing to do with these school goals or district goals or set of people. So 18.5.14 effectiveness policy, it allows you to set your own goals. So they may be, that gets into the wrong part. They may be goals on individual. They may be goals on, look at, sits on effectiveness, transportation efficiency, which is in 23.2 policy. Then Newcomer said, when Bricker responded, go down to 21, let's get legal advice for work session, turning the comments into a motion. Well, that motion died 2-2. Well, of course, Robert's Rules of Order, which you follow, small group, Robert's Rules says when it's 2-2, it doesn't pass. There's not enough votes to pass. There's not 3 votes if, 4 people are there. So, Richard had read the policy, they must be 50 years old. He said that means we have to re-vote. Well, Newcomer protested, asking if Robert's Rules of Order really were revised, was permissible. And then on page 5 and 26, the superintendent, this tie-breaking procedure is set in customary board practice as I read your policies. Now we get into conundrum here. The conundrum is Robert Rules says, now they've adopted a policy that says we will abide by Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, or whatever the latest version is, which would be the latest revised version. But then they've got a complete policy that says they don't have to re-vote. In other words, the superintendent pointed that out. Now, here's kind of the limitation you have. Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised small groups, is less formal than Robert's Rules of Order for larger groups as well. So as a result of that, there's a situation here where somebody has to figure out which one of these things actually are rules or the revoting. And so he asked for an interpretation, making a second motion by this is what Newcomer did. And then Brock motion out of order, declaring it nobody second, so it's out of order. Now, really, under Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised for small groups, you don't have to have a second. Never try that because everybody's should have. That's one of those things you can make an exception to, have a second. So then, what he does was on line 37. He said, I'll get my own legal. I'll just go out here and see what all. A lawyer say a lot of it. So a lawyer looked at this very carefully and said, well, based on your policy, you're bound by Robert's rules, which law proves. Thus, any amendments to these rules will have to apply Robert's rules in spirit and in law. But he also said in line 144, council said the board has a policy related to agenda preparation with any person. Now, what does any of this have to do with the question? But then we move into what he really said. He goes on line 147. A chief consideration is whether an item rejected by a member at a meeting and an item not included on the agenda for a specified meeting can be placed on future agenda. Now, again, this is all the time. Laura's getting it all the time. But he's looking into some things that really, he goes to the ethics commission. They said, yes, it may be down in 151. However, it may be wise to clarify or involvement, if any, in termination of meeting agenda. Now, what does this have to do with which one of these things are to follow? Okay. But then we go over and, Clausen is another, now we can't really talk about, but the board, the vice president of the board said, you're really doing a private investigation. You're going outside the role of the corporate board. And the county board is really a corporate body. Now you have an agent board, he was not made agent board, but then he goes outside the role of the board and does an investigation. Well, then they hop over it. He says, Pritchard says, well, this and that, and they say, you said, if you've done a private investigation, that it is problematic, no matter what you find. So Newcomer had said that campaign, they're now trying to hold it accountable for it. And then they decided they moved in, board, and now we get to part of procedural 164. And I don't know why he did it. Newcomer made a motion that consideration of items raised by council be placed on the agenda for additional discussion and probable or possible county board action. Then he now. So we haven't really heard from the lawyer answering the question. So he wants to discuss this by moving it into things about the agenda, something like that, or work item. And then Rockmore said, well, is there any unanimous consent for this? And there wasn't, because somebody made an objection. So an objection. Now, that's also in Robert's rules of overview revised for the full groups. A lot of times people don't understand that, but it can be, is there any objection to this concept, this idea? So there was objection, so of course that means they couldn't do this. And so then he begins to realize that in fact, on line 169, if revolved work section would relate facilities, which requires a first glance so we can get advanced notification for our intent, especially in the western area. That is purely legal. You, Jason, in that you cannot decide ahead of time who specific. And I think, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, you can decide position or what you may want to do, but you can't say, this is shown by the code, no longer need health ed teaching. But this is, we don't know what they're really talking about. So then, Newcomer comes back again. He knew that this meant an Alvin area. That Newcomer asked the county superintendent, as CEO of the county board, he's done his homework. And this, instructional leaders, school district, have ordered us to closing facilities if it comes to that. So before the superintendent and could respond to that, this old guy named Pig makes a motion for the board to go into executive session to talk about facilities. There's a real problem. If you make a general motion, let's talk about facilities, then you are not following the ethics laws related to open meetings. Now, I think he might have been okay if he had said, I don't even think there'd be a way he could do a motion because this is all prospecting. We're not in this yet. So you would not be very easily able to go to the executive to talk about something that's problematic that will have to be brought up in a more formal sense. So anyway, they go into Newcomer and voted no. Then newcomer says, well, I'm just going to give a, a vote. I'll explain my purpose. You did it right. And of course, then they get into a puzzle here, and it appears that they don't believe you can make a vote exclamation when indeed it was rules newly revised for small group, saying you do. I'm not recommending this. Then he said, "This is suspicious. I'm not going into the executive session. You're going into a reason that's really, really not awful." So I got a quote on board member from the counties, and she said they always go into executive session and they make it. I said, "Did you join?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, then you're probably, if they ever get called on this, don't you think you'll be part of this group as well?" She said, "I'm not fault." So if you don't go into executive session, that you say things that may be correctly the most, like general, like facilities, personnel, transportation. Then if you drill badly enough about it, you wouldn't go in because it may be something that later catches up the board. So then we move it on a little bit. Then, of course, line 90, getting more of things. They do learn that school, if it's small school, it's very successful. Small school sometimes, school I went to in Kentucky when I was in grade school, we had 80 kids, but we had very high standing academically because it was really, literally, it's not one room school. We had split grade, first graders learn, they taught second graders, like that. And it was very tight knit, but you learned a lot. We had fourth grade teachers for 2 years, we had fractions for 2 years brother house, but that's different. So really what happened here is he said, he thought the idea of looking at these alternatives was time to do, but he was surprised because the board now saying, okay, this school closes, this school closes. In fact, they even say that. So anyway, they go on to correct the superintendent. In fact, go on to 16. What you're thinking, superintendents were locked to do. Remember, this guy's matter of fact. He knows the faults. He knows the process. He knows what Charles will want to say. And for Dick said, "You work for us, and we want this done." So he's saying, "Mr. Superintendent, you're our own employee. Literally, you work for us, and we want this done." Pritchard comes back and says, "Superintendent, I'm your CEO. You evaluate me as such, not your employee." Because the superintendent is the CEO of the school district. And in the same section of law, back site, it also says at the end of that sentence, and also responsible for implementing federal policies. So the superintendent is more than employed for its constitutional position, but at least mentioned the Constitution. So then things get a little bit. And then for King, the superintendent be directly to fully investigate this matter. The motion was adopted. So the board is saying they kind of adopt this motion 4-1. And then Pritchard, then he gets the board council, not the private council, the board council. The board council said, "Well, I'm glad you didn't do this because that motion is really sort of illegitimate. And if you had followed it, then it may not have had any practical value," is what it essentially says. So then newcomer made a motion that the board is on 2.5, convene as a whole. Now, whole board is a concept that's very important for training development. Whole board training, which is mentioned in training regulations, is where you consider the board, and this is what I think you have to consider all the time. So it's not 5 people in the system. The board is 60. It's 60 because the superintendent is secretary. That is a codified carved exception in law. So never say we have a 5-member board, we have a 6-member. We have voting members, 5, or whoever shows up. So he's trying to make this point here. So the motion passed. Now this one board member always abstains. He doesn't like any controversy. He's Mr. Fix-It, but he always abstains. And I've known board members like that. They always are ready to jump to do something that comes to the vote. And then sort of shy away. This is how it's always 4-1, he abstains. Now, by law, you can't abstain. There's some kind of theory that goes around that board members can not abstain from voting. And I don't know the ins and outs of that. I don't think there's been any state interpretations on that.
Vote no is not abstaining.
No voting, well, for one, maybe he had an extension, I think. With Paulson abstaining, or,
So he just says, I'm not going to.
yeah, he said something, but I don't have that right working here, but it's really 4-0. It's what, so that's good catch. Because he didn't vote, so it's a vote of 4. You're right about that. That'll be down here another place too. So in other words, by a margin 4-0, then they decide to do all these things. Then the next section to newcomer, he had some technology, good PowerPoint or something, gives the ins and outs of all this alternative way of doing things. He says it's doable. And then he declares that Malvern LSIC is the only one done in town. And they do seem to be pretty active. Some LSICs were born, but they seem to be pretty active. So then the LSIC chair, she presented at the next meeting. She said, this is a heavy lift. We could do this, we could get something acceptance from out of school. She's gone back, done a little bit of homework about, and we're seeking funding and legislative support. And then Bert says, what about state board of education? And nobody really responds to that. And then as the discussion continued, he said, despite all the stuff going on here, I think we financially, here's where superintendents have to read the board because they know where the board's heading. And this was his ace in the hole. He knew that they maybe didn't have to do this immediately or anything. So he says, he goes on to say from line 2 to 44, despite this despite all this stuff that's going on here, I think we'll be financially okay for the coming school year. We need to revisit by next year this same time. Enrollment declines, we must expect more and more neutral decline. And then the initial projections he provided the board will likely need to consider. Now, we don't know what those initial projections are. Were they done with the central office? Were they done with the State Department? He just said by alternative or by initial projections. So the board might have said, well, who gave you this? Where's this information coming from? So we don't know that. And then on the next page, but he says, he doesn't throw in the towel. It's the board will work on this throughout the next year, knowing our work may be or will be out of date. In other words, he's saying you can time up, central office time up. He looks at it very superintendent, say, hey, we had a small office with highs up for a long time. This is the way we'll do this, and we might have a bond idea for this. And then poor old Elijah, that he thinks the whole thing changed because this is the thing. So then he went on to start asking, getting into these innovations. So this Mr. Ortiz said, I'm a false mind conservative. He said, I'll never vote with you, but I like some of the things you say. You kind of got some good ideas here. So he's giving. Then when he got into innovations, he began to realize that there is flexibility in law for county boards, including 1825, which is the section the state board uses when they adopt policy. There's a section of that law that allows you, as a county board, to bring good ideas of student achievement to the state board. If they adopt those, then that might be how you feel like you can optimize student achievement. That's just one example. I think there's about 39. So somebody you go into this.
What was it?
1825.
1825.
Yeah, it's the second part of 1825. There is an exception there. Now, I don't know. I don't believe any board has ever really done that. But during the time we were in Common Core, the Putnam County Superintendent came before the state board and said he was a former math teacher, I think, or had math experience. He said, what you're doing for math will be much better if you did this. So the state board can hold around about for a month and tell you to change Common Core the way that he suggested because he made such a big case. So that's what this 1825 basically says. If you're really, really concerned about student achievement, and you think you can do things differently, then bring us something. It doesn't prove it, but you can show us a different model, and it's all throughout the movie. And then, so he said, the superintendent, now look at line 268, he's really great. The superintendent provided a very important decision-making document that discusses whether flexibility of state need are situational. And then he goes on to say, well, on the discipline policy, the legislature, after 2 or 3 years of it is a state policy to make it consistent throughout the state. But then he goes on to say, there may be other ways we can maximize or optimize the state board, use the word optimize our flexibility for innovation and things like that. And then he, weeks later, 272, the board learned, giving enrollment figures that the school district blew more students than expected. Now remember what the superintendent told. Somehow he had this projection, or somehow he got a gut. This is going to happen. And then our school was a proportion. Now, as this kind of wraps up, newcomer, this was his base. He knew these people, he believed it. That was his political base, that was the transaction. Then he goes to that community and tells the LSIC, of the group, somebody, hey, folks, this is what's happening. But look what he says on line 277. The board is bound by fiscal responsibilities. Has he ever mentioned that before? I mean, he's got ideas, but has he really ever mentioned that before? His CEFO idea, his previous career is kind of catching up with him. But then he goes and he says, I can't change it. Now, can you imagine being in an auditorium or someplace in that county area, and you've got this guy who really, you've kind of elected, everybody sort of knows it, and he's gone along with this innovation idea, this thing the LSIC want to do, and he breaks the bad news. He, like every other board member, and the board is bound by fiscal responsibilities. I can't change this. And then, of course, you know how to see it. They thought they had been free. So as we go through this, and Jason can get into the legal things, there are some things in here that I think are important to point out. Parliamentary procedure and open meetings laws totally are different things. In fact, I got sent some questions to the ethics commission about some things that I've been reading about county boards and reports about county boards. The county board does abide by parliamentary procedure, but a lot of things that are in reports are things like speaking to the audience, we have delegation. State board doesn't do that if you're advised by both rights. If somebody comes before you, if I'm a delegate, come before you and speak to you, then it's really, you can ask me to clarify what I'm saying, but it's not really a good idea. In fact, it's discouraged and even may be unwarranted to say, well, I think your idea is good. It's, and then get into an interchange because the ethics commission group, that's moving into the agenda item you have approved from your agenda. But if you just sit and listen, and then somebody has the says, well, maybe let's consider this for a future meeting. Then we get into whether to get that on the agenda in some counties because the agenda is put together literally by the superintendent, clearance with the board and to the board. So in fact, that's a big issue in Berkeley County years ago. So Roger Hanshaw, who has expertise in parliamentary procedure, explained he thought, and I don't know if this has changed or not, he thought that what you really could do is you could say if somebody brings to your attention something like a new way of doing bus route or something like that, then you could say, well, let's put this on the agenda. What would that have to consent? Then you're getting in to talk about a future agenda during that portion of the meeting when you're talking about something on the agenda. That's sort of what I think we can talk about, right? Don't really get into those interchanges like that. Even if it has to be put on the agenda, you might be, if I understand right, violating the finer point of the Ethics Commission opinion because you're getting to designing an agenda in common. So I don't know the answer. Maybe Jason, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think, I'm in Bourbon County the other day, we talked about this, and the board president in Bourbon County, when I was working for you, remember, she said, what we do is we wait to the involved delegations. They have 5 groups of 5 people. Then she says, is there any board sentiment have any comments to a future event? I think that's the one. I don't think you can comment like, because you've ended your delegations, or sent home, they sometimes leave the room. And then she said, we do get the spirit about this. We say, now, board members, you've heard this, do we need to be like on future agenda? And then that could be a way, and that is pretty way I think. Because some of those items people bring up, they're anecdotal, but wherever there's smoke, there's fire sometimes, so they may be something you want to look at. And that would be a way, I think, not to buy an open meeting. So now I've done the parliamentary, and I've done the, looking at individual board member rules and things like that. You know, when new board members come on board, after you've gone through a hasty orientation, you still have a little fire, brimstone left. Hey, we want to get this done. I've been waiting for years to get this done. There is a way to do that. Is to work in group and have a group, have a culture that whatever you bring up as a board, there is some way we can do this. It might not end up on the agenda. We might have to discuss it at a work session. We might not even like it, and we might, if you brought it up, it's premature because it might get into something that's not really fully developed yet enough to discuss. But anyway, so that's my portion, and again, we'll get to some other things in a moment. So, Jason.
Well, I think Dr. Paul, one of the things you mentioned is, you know, a lot of these board members often here, no, you can't do that. And the trainings that your organization has or has in the past. So, in terms of the future, I think you indicated, hey, they can do something.
Yeah.
I'm hoping on the future, it's not, hey, here's all the things you cannot do, because there's so many things you can do, right?
Yeah.
But I just don't think that they're exposed to that. So I'm hopeful that that will kind of change the future for these folks in terms of all our kinds of understanding the things that they can do.
Right, and that's all flexibility. That's what we have to propose and giving a little flexibility
Right.
in the law. So we
And then when we talk about goals and things of that nature, for example, I know this board has to do a self-appraisal at some point, right? But that self-appraisal, for example, you know, if I'm a student and the teacher gives me a test and says, I'm going to give you this same test at the end of the year, what am I going to do? I'm going to look at that test between now and the end of the year, self-appraisal with it.
Right.
So one of the helpful tools that I've been from a roadmap standpoint and outline standpoint, I get on your webpage, I see county board member self-appraisal forms. I see as our board include discussions about county goals, means to achieve, and among other things, pages of their self-appraisal that you hate for the first time that you see that to be when you sit down and see that self-appraisal, right? So again, just in terms of some guidance to the board, to be a successful board, to feel like tasks that are appropriate, that the state has an expectation of. One of the things that I would strongly encourage you to do is go on the School Board Association's webpage, or you can take this in terms of the guidelines that they provided for that self-appraisal. You know, again, it's the road. Otherwise, you'll sit there just at the end, and X number of months you'll sit down and have to do this self-appraisal and think, gosh, I wish I would look at this from the beginning. You know, because that gives you an idea of the things that you can and can't do. You know, I'm a person that never likes to say no. I find a way to get the resolve in the current balance of education. You know, one of the things that we talked about here was this, what was it? Someone abstained?
Yeah.
You know, if I get that phone call, I'm asking, like, Morgan, do you really want to abstain? And you are elected by the people to do what? Vote. So let's not get into that situation. I get it. There might be an abstain, but there might be a reason for that, whatever that reason might be. Maybe it's your wife or relative, and what are you going to do? You're going to recuse yourself, you're going to leave the room, you're not going to vote. That's what things are going to reflect that. But, you know, you're elected to vote. And I don't think any counties have done this. I mean, my position is if we get you a policy in place, when I've seen this in counties, an abstain vote's a yes vote. You know, I kind of wish that were the scenario in the case. In terms of folks kind of saying, but I don't think this is the board that has the history of doing that. You all vote on difficult issues whereby you don't have, kind of that tie-related issue. But Dr. Paul, in terms of the legal aspects, you tell me kind of what and talk about. One of the things I will say is we're looking at this board started generally from fresh. We've got a new superintendent, we've got experienced board members, we've got great staff in this family. And man, you've got an opportunity to write your own script with a new superintendent with those goals and expectations. So, I know it's easy to say we can't do that, we can't do that.
One of the ones that I was thinking about, if you have two policies that are conflicting, what do you do? In other words, you have this policy of revoting and then you have all the rules we're bound by. Which one takes precedent?
So from a policy standpoint, what you all should be doing every night, because you are incurring a significant expense, and whether it's an expense that's well paid or well paid, it's policies that generally you have to have in place. And you're a county that has those from a vendor, right? You have a vendor that produces a significant amount of policies. There's so many times that you as county board members, and even as a superintendent, often don't even know you have a policy on that. We have a search box we've got to type into. Morgan, if we're trying to hire a service personnel employee that won't hire classified, there's always that issue of, wait, who's going to get the job depending on seniority? Well, guess what? You have a policy on it. So many counties don't realize what those policies are. Pay attention when you're adopting your policies, okay? Really try to pay attention, don't rubber stamp those, read them, and pay attention to the product. How in terms of the conflict, in terms of Robert and the policy conflict, in terms of who takes preference, was it the issue with the 2-2?
Yeah.
Or the 2-2. So as it relates to that, 2-2 is what? 2-2 is the type of, that means it's what?
0-0.
And that often means, oftentimes board members will say, and I've had superintendents do this, it doesn't happen very often, that they can break the tie. Now it's like, no, but I'm serious. I still get that. I bet you if you check my emails and Google that question somehow over the past 25 years, that's come up. But in terms of a 2-2, that's a dead agenda item that did not muster appropriate vote, right?
Right, it's defeated.
It's defeated.
There's not three, or there's not a majority.
So whatever was being voted on that extent is a dead motion.
Right.
Then
Some other things here, like when you're going into executive session, if I understand, and board members, if I understand the ethics commission rulings on open meetings, you have to be pretty specific. We want to discuss the X and such relating to facilities at the high school, or something like that. You can't just say facility, transportation.
I've not looked back at your meetings. I've not looked back at your minutes, but I can look at meetings of other counties, and I tell you what, there's big misuse of executive session throughout the state. And it is eventually becomes recognized when there's an audit that comes in, candidly. The ethics commission, if you go on the webpage and talk about executive session, they do not want an agenda that at the end says executive session. And if our agenda has that, again, we should probably address that and fix that. We just cannot have a standalone executive session. There has to be specific agenda items that the public knows will be discussed that night. Executive session isn't meant to protect you all, it's meant to protect other types of things. Now, we can go to an agenda item, and we've got personnel tonight, make a recommendation to hire, a director of special education. And if it comes to that item, you all may have questions. And on that personnel, can we go to executive session and discuss that personnel matter? Yes. Can we go into executive session? Again, I've got to have an agenda item, okay? I've got to stop if it's occurring, executive sessions, getting misused and abused, and just placing it on an agenda and using that to talk about everything from A to Z.
There's only so many reasons you can go with.
There's only so many. I know the easy thing is, and I've been in those meetings, I'm guilty of it, or maybe I'm something as it relates to a pending litigation or pending grievance, and next thing you know, that conversation kind of tails off as to a number of other topics. That's the easy thing to do. We've got to find a way not to do that. You're a public school board, public school meetings, a lot of discussion, and things that aren't easy occur where they have to occur right out here in the open for the community and folks to see.
I've got a question. You recall at some point that anyone that we discuss in executive session has the right to be there. So if there's a person on the agenda, they're not at the meeting, can we go to executive session to talk about that?
So there's two things. I think the ethics commission, they kind of take this. You got to think of two things. You got to think of, you're talking about open meetings and you're talking about personnel. The ethics commission is kind of taking the position, hey, from an ethics standpoint, there's no requirement that that person be there. And then they go on to say, but from a personnel standpoint, you better be thinking about what the nature of that discussion is and why you're going back to discuss, and help me out and tell me how you even got back there to begin with on that agenda item. Like, how are we going in and talking about, for example, the social studies teacher at school X, and the board members are concerned about what's occurring and what they're hearing, and wait, how do we even get back there to begin with? Right? Where on the agenda did we have the right to go back there?
Well, what I'm thinking is that, say, social studies ethics is on there for transfer.
Yeah.
Or just step up to administration position or something.
And
And as part of the community, we know the history.
Yeah.
You can't just talk about that in open session.
I think more on that, you want to go into executive session, the superintendent has made a recommendation. The superintendent's made a recommendation based upon who he or she believes the most qualified. And when we look at making the entire recommendations, I get it, you folks in this community know everything. I mean, Pocahontas County is so unique. I mean, you might, I know you're 219, I might snowshoe to you, but you know, and you're one of the other, and it is unique. And I would caution you all, when making those hiring decisions, the superintendent makes those recommendations. You folks have the right to ask some questions, but always make sure we're going back to one thing. We're having to hire the person that's most qualified, agree to disagree. The code outlines what it is that we look at. When we're looking at administrator, we'll look at 9 different factors. That's it. Those 9 factors aren't where they go to church, who really friends with, things of that nature. So there are some limitations. That doesn't mean, Morgan, that you're not going to go back and ask questions about recommendations of people who are being recommended for employment. Again, I don't think that about things any employee's due process, but I'll tell you this, if that employee doesn't get that job, I want you to understand that executive session, your conversations aren't privileged. Okay? They're not privileged. So what you talk about in executive session, and if we're back there talking about an employee that didn't get a job, when we find ourselves in agreements or otherwise, and the employee's representatives ask you what was discussed back there in executive session, you're under oath, you got to tell them. Yeah, you got to be candid and honest. So executive session isn't meant to be a cover whereby what discussed doesn't come out. The only time that there's a privilege, if it's an attorney-client related privilege, if we're back there talking about litigation or giving you some guidance on who I think maybe should or shouldn't be hired from a standpoint of their qualifications, what the exposure and risk is. We'll always keep that in mind. Just to say, hey, whatever occurs back in the second session, you got to assume could find its way back out. It shouldn't from y'all individually, in terms of preserving that, but it's not meant to.
So basically, like during a meeting, like right now, say, ask Mr. President to go to executive session or what. So when I say, Mr. President, can we go to executive session on policy? That would be appropriate.
No, because we don't have any agenda item for that.
We don't have an agenda item for policy.
It's not on the agenda. I think, and Dr. Call would be more familiar with this as well, is a lot of counties who have been kind of audited by the state, for example, I forget which county it was, really took a little bit of a ding, and it might have been Tyler County, for example. Really, Mingo, yes, it was Mingo, I'm sorry. They went in and looked at like, my golly, in an executive session, a lot, but not only, I believe, a lot, but maybe at times when they shouldn't be going, they're just calling for an executive session. You know, it needs to be, I want to go to an executive session to discuss something in the agenda. Harrison County tonight, I was supposed to be on the phone, and someone else is covering it. The agenda is discussing disposal of excess real estate. We have a few buildings there that we need to dispose of. As Mr. Grimes indicated, there's a, a handful of times when we go to executive session, one of those is to do what? To discuss real estate matters. Right, and the reason for that is if these buildings are worth something, maybe we want to sell them, maybe we know what the value is, but we don't want to sell them so short. So again, we have a specific agenda item that we're going into executive session on.
Specific, have to be very specific.
Well, it's got an agenda item.
Gotta have
You
an
can't say executive session.
Has to have an agenda item.
You can't just say a word like simple.
It's got to be some reasonable reference to it.
Okay.
But again, and Ms. Klein, I think you've seen this. Counties have to get away from abusing and misusing executive session. And it has been and continues to be kind of an issue for our state. So I went off on sideways. Yeah, it's because again, over the years, and we've got a board that's been on the board for a number of years, you've seen a lot of changes over the years. Now everything is what we're having to make sure this is broadcasted, that it's maintained and kept, so we have that visibility. So, when state and others look at your board meetings and see the number of executive sessions and the reasons or lack thereof, that can be concerning. Yeah, or
You're gonna hire the most qualified person. You know what I'm saying? So that's, their name is on the agenda. Morgan calls for an executive session, and we get into executive session, he said, I know this person, he did this in Upshur County. So we go back out of executive session, and we tell the superintendent to bring us another name. What happens at that? Do they have to bring us another name? We can say repost.
now,
What is the right lingo for that?
I think a couple of things, and I know we're all different things, but superintendent is statutorily indicated to make the next recommendation. The only thing I would caution the board on is oftentimes the superintendent might not be in a position to do that at that particular meeting. Maybe that would come to the next, because oftentimes I look at the superintendent standpoint, we're hiring personnel. We've got that number one individual, we've really not been back, we've thought about 2, 3, 4, or 5. So be patient, but have an expectation that the directive is that the superintendent will bring another recommendation to the board. Yeah.
What if that never happens?
Well, if moving forward, I think your recommendations that.
Oh, I'm not talking about.
I'm not fixing. Whatever you get them up, intended to make them. In other words, maybe Ms. Klein can discuss it because it happened years ago. Was there a specific board member asked for a specific
It
personnel?
wasn't with me. It
Yeah.
was with my predecessor, by a man who hired me. And, the board asked, he'd been off for some back issues for a while, almost a month or more. And they wanted, and it happened to be a sports issue. Shocking. But they wanted a coach recommendation, and he was not prepared to give that. And told them that this is way back before the new hiring procedures, back before the days of interviews and such. This was in the 80s, and it was a Supreme Court decision. I think I was in college then. So it's been a long time. But they summarily fired that superintendent that night. And then he went on and appealed the decision. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. He was reinstated with complete back pay.
Jason, on that question about you work for us, you are our employee, so we can direct you around. That's purely erroneous with superintendent.
Right. Hey, I got something. So, talking about the agenda, procedure. So, with me again, say I want to get, something like fundraising on a month's agenda down the road. What's the proper chain of command to do that? For me as a board, do I send an email to, Miss Superintendent here, or what, how do I do that?
So again, I think this falls in again that topic that Dr. O'Call had some of the questions.
Yeah.
So if I went in and looked at your policies and looked at the agenda setting, I'm going to assume, I'm probably willing to bet, it indicates that the agenda is probably set by the superintendent along with the board president.
That's correct.
That is almost universal.
Right, I mean, that's kind of that language in terms of, that's kind of where that dialogue is in terms of trying to, get an agenda item from those two individuals. And to the extent that it may not make itself on an agenda, I like in terms of Dr. Caldwell talked about earlier. How does a board member get that on an agenda and maybe where can it have an agenda? Because your discussion was about the group that came in a presentation.
Right.
And I know if you sit there and you listen to folks and you feel horrible that you can't respond to them. And, you know, they leave here when your meeting's still going and they're already put on Facebook that you just sat there and stared at them and providing response. Right? You gotta be able to listen. If you want to be on the board, they're the ones voting for you. They don't understand what your limitations are. So on that issue, you know, I think it's always good every meeting, and I don't think if you or don't. I know Grant County used to have a nice little script that they read to the people in the audience, kind of understood that to an extent. And you know, to engage, so, you know, that helps in that regard. But I think Dr. O'Call's thought in terms of a board member making a request for something that's being potentially placed on the agenda at the end of a meeting. And I don't know how you articulated maybe how that would look on an agenda, what it would appear. My opinion would be is that though that still requires the approval of the majority of the board to place that on an agenda. Does that make sense for the future?
So when you, like when you say future meetings, then you could have consideration of agenda items by board members or something like that. And then that way, if no one has anything, then, and I think still with the policies we have, most often, boards have a policy, you mentioned superintendent, board president determine the agenda, that you would still have to go through that process to abide with your policy, but at least you're mentioning it in the open meeting. And then if it's not on the agenda, protected both can resolve, then there, you know, you can keep, I guess, bringing it up.
There's a policy that says that it's 3 board members.
Okay, so you have your own meeting. Yeah. Or your own.
The president of the board, the superintendent.
See, that they're very specific.
So if Mr. Gibson wants that on the agenda.
Right.
And our board president and superintendent, maybe not. If he can get 2 of us to
Okay.
agree with him, then
That's
it's on the agenda.
But still, it's appropriate, and my proper channel would be to present my concept for the agenda to president and superintendent. That's the way that's it.
Jason, can we get into matters of the board, because I try to do the matters of the board. Whenever stuff is brought up, then can I suggest or make a request that it be put on the next agenda for next board meeting? And if they, let's say, back to what Thomas was said, I can follow that up by saying, can I get approval of the majority of the board?
And
Is that?
I'm with Mr. McCann. The only thing I'd caution you on is we're not going to get in a whole lot of dialogue about it.
No.
Right. Not on the topic, maybe trying to explain or otherwise, these folks will kind of respect and understand what you're kind of asking for and what your thought process is, but again, I think initially, when you come to these two folks, there's a strong chance that a lot of the items are going to find themselves on there, right?
We've never had problems with that. I don't foresee.
What if we are in a discussion with school personnel, teachers, and a board member calls for an executive session? And I say, we can't because it don't fit in that criteria.
I mean,
We did that to happen.
and I think that's the hard thing, Mr. Grimes, is to start to understand as a board, and maybe you all do a good job with this, maybe others need on that learning curve, is the easy thing to do, make them an executive session, you go in, where you're really supposed to be in
So
executive
it's what I
session.
said, it didn't fit.
Yeah.
And one of the notices, and I had to say, this does not fit. We can't go.
Difficult discussions have to happen out here for public.
Whenever I was interviewed by Ms. Crown, interviewed the ethics board, she made a recommendation that, like I say, and it's on our agenda now. Anytime there's personnel, there's a sentence at the bottom says that we may go into executive session and discuss.
And you're not,
That you can cover that.
it may, subject to majority board approval, probably says something.
Ms. Crown said that's the way the state does it. That's what she recommended to.
Yeah.
We really don't want executive session like that. We're going about
Well, one last thing, but
Mr. O'Connell there. Objections.
what, how? I've never heard of it.
Well, that would be if you were having, consent, is it consent of the board that we do this? In other words, if no one dissents and it's not heard, and it's something that's maybe pretty simple procedural thing, then that would be almost tantamount to an action item. So in other words, you would say, is there any objection that we do this or that? And if there is no objection, then we would proceed with it. It's usually used for very non-technical things. And the Senate is sort of do that also.
And
But if you could take things off.
to the extent, this board kind of gets into that role, then I hate to say it, then it kind of turns into maybe not a really good functioning board, right? You won't do that, you got a great system. And we've run into spots was occurs. This gentleman reports nothing but positive things for the school system, which is awesome, so I want to thank you for that, that's kind of our overall. Right, so, and I think this client's recognized that, and even the people I've talked to the state, there is no other place like Pocahontas. And I'm all, think that we have fun, this is just kind of additional training otherwise, and, it's all. Or we can continue.
Yeah, if somebody votes no, though, there's 4 yeses and a no, I'll always say, let the record show that Mr. McNabb voted no.
See, I didn't recommend any of those things, I was just pointing out something, too tied up in things, it's strangeness, that you don't even need.
It's the same way if we're voting on one of the board's family members, I'll say, let the record show that they accused herself and it's out of the record.
All that.
That's for God, so we can vote with, that's, because, yeah, so if anything ever comes up, it's in the minutes
Right.
of the meeting.
In a case like that, there's 3 of us qualified for the sword. But if one of our family members is on the agenda, we excuse ourselves, that leaves 2 people vote. But it's still the majority.
Correct.
It would be, I know that, yeah.
Yeah, and then, it happens. Yeah. It does happen, yeah. And I think Dr. Saul will kind of move to the next one, but I think, again, I'm not sat back and participating, watching the board meetings or otherwise. Historically, I really haven't. I'm only hearing from the board maybe, personnel season, like 2 years ago, and then maybe a couple of months ago, so it's far and few between. But I think one thing that board members you always got to keep in mind as well is always just trying to keep that somewhat calm, cool composure, even though, maybe difficult related issues, because there's other, as in the skies watching it right now. Who doesn't watch us, but hello to those folks. But, you don't want to be the poster child the Dr. might use in presentations, but hey, don't do this.
Yeah.
But in any event, Dr. O'Connell, some of the other topics, I'm sorry, I know that Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that sometimes, when discussing the agenda and items, we, as superintendent, you have to direct people back to the policy that regulates that particular thing.
That's that is my
Yes.
secretary.
That is the role of the secretary, is to say, in policy, this is the procedure for doing this, and this is how we have to do it, and follow this policy.
And sure, you all have to understand that from your superintendent,
Yes.
secretary of the board, that the fact that maybe it's no, don't take that as closing the door. It is we have to function in a way that is, organized and uniform. And I know I hate to say policy driven, but they're there for a reason, and the outcomes turn into success. That's right. Right? They really do. Yeah, I start with board members, rest of the community, thank you all have offices here somewhere. And thank you that you sat in on the interviews. I get it, they truly do. So, one of the hard things is to educate folks on really what your role is, for you all to understand that role is in conjunction with the superintendent.
Right.
So you kind of master that, it can lead to some unfavorable chaos.
I had some other things that I made a request for the administration attorney, and your board is already doing this. One of the issues that comes up on some of these reports would be if you are discussing something and you see someone in the audience you think may have expertise on that. I think the way to do that, and they didn't answer this one, but I think the way to do that is what Dr. Williams is already doing. She would say, does any member of the board have any question for someone in the audience who they feel have expertise in this? That way, you're not saying, Mr. Jones, you're not just pulling it out of the air. Mr. Jones, what do you think about this? But you're letting the secretary of the board direct so you can ask that question. And I see nothing wrong. Now, do you need to put that on the agenda? When we talk about this subject, we may allow questions from the audience. Maybe you can say that. You say we may indeed have, maybe do that. But I think the way of directing it is very important here, because that way the board is not leaving its role as a board member. You're actually responding to your CEO and your secretary, and she's asking if you need to ask anyone in the audience. Yeah. I don't see why that would raise an issue with anyone. Because you're going through the superintendent.
And I think I've heard you say that before, going through the superintendent for those issues, and when we're meetings, maybe we've got questions for these folks as well, kind of utilizing the superintendent and our treasurer,
Right.
Other folks.
And I think that's just critical, because you're in a board meeting sometimes, and the board will say, well, Treasurer Jones, what do you think about this? Really, I think the superintendent should be the one who says after the treasurer's report, because the treasurer does not report to you. The treasurer, you only have one individual who reports to you as a CEO. So it's kind of improper, I think, I'm more fair than this, for me to say, well, can we do it? I mean, you really need to ask the superintendent if there anyone else you would like to hear from. Or if the treasurer presents, you may say, superintendent may say, well, you have any questions? Or the treasurer, or anybody who's in, the business division or something like that. Because that shows respect for the superintendent as the CEO, and it also shows that you're going to stop working out and talking to the administrator. But I brought that up in Berber County, and they don't do that. They didn't like that. So I just brought it up as an idea. But I like the idea because it keeps the decorum correctly. Because the superintendent reports to you. No other staff reports to you, and they certainly should. So I like that idea. But that's in a board, individual board.
In a small county like ours, that financial person is
Yeah.
a great person, with always more. They just, we had a treasurer's report,
Mhm.
and she just told what the budget was, and we could get to it, or budget meetings or stuff. Yeah. Here, sure, do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can get this superintendent. She did say, any questions?
Yeah. And again, it's whatever practice you have. What I'm really talking about too, is just simply seeing something comes up on the agenda. You see someone in the audience who you think may have a good response to that. And I think there ought to be a formalized way of doing that, letting the secretary or board lead you into that. But if the treasurer says anybody have any questions, well, then that's different now.
Yeah, we take that to happen.
Yeah.
On the,
I guess be Sarah now, say you, I mean, questions. But
But I can be quiet and wait till Dr. Williams addresses and then.
I think that's, I think it's good body.
And I think it's part of the cost too. Don't use the board meeting to ask Sarah, for example, let's say we notice the electric bill of the field house, $500, $100, right? You send out that information, to the extent the board has anything that in advance, if they have an opportunity to look, reach out. Right? I mean, reach out, and I know you're gonna find a way to communicate with all these different people, the ways they like it, whether it's email, phone call. Everyone's got their own unique things. The right, that superintendent has her hands full.
So when I present something to the board, I always try to collaborate with whatever director it is. When I have Mr. Gibson and I was working on facilities, I have Mr. Gibson available for questions. I think it's a reciprocal relationship.
Right.
And you have to include your director,
Right.
and make them available for those questions and confirmation. And that's really how we've done it. We said discussion, review, and possible action. And I would say, Mr. Gibson, would you present on this portion? Any questions from Mr. Gibson? That's how we have been doing it. I think that's worked out well for us.
One of the things that sometimes happens in meetings, some say in the audience, I'd like us to, they say they want an executive session. I don't know, Jason, if you've heard that in some counties, some of the audience or delegation say, well, I want my remarks to be taken up in executive session. They have no more authority to do that, Jason, I think, than I, anyone in the audience does. Only the board determines who goes into executive. Now, we talked about some parameters about that, who goes to the executive session. So no one has the ability to do that. And then it should be another thing that I've seen happen. Some will say, some of the audience will say, point of order. Well, really, I don't know how you officially handle that, but a delegation cannot say point of order to a board that is convened in the, I don't know if I've ever.
Well, I think we have to remember, whenever we have meetings, it's a meeting of the Board of Education, not a meeting of the audience. If anybody wants to be involved.
Right. It's a meeting of the Board of Education in public, not a meeting of public.
Okay, there you go.
And that's that old saying, that's that old saying, that's very true. Because some meetings can get so off kilter, and you don't really. And look, I think another thing that Chris brought up, what you may want to do is say, here is the way we conduct our meetings, and anyone who comes in gets that on, here's what you will look at in the meeting. Here's how the flow of the meeting is. Here are things that are really how we are going to handle things like that. And then no one would ever be able to say they didn't, well, they could. But,
I got a question for Jason. Say we have 30 people show up. All of us got the same question. Can we, it used to be we could appoint a spokesman and say, you have 5 minutes.
Right.
Can you still do that, or do you have to go through the whole thing?
Yeah, hopefully before that fire starts, the superintendent, and other folks are kind of calming that down before it comes to you. If it does come to you, again, I bet you if we look at your policy and type in delegation or open meetings, there might be a window of time, for example, as to the window of time for comments. And you take that amount of time, and maybe it's divided a month, for example, what that window of time is. Does that make sense? So that you're not going to sit here for 30 people that get unlimited amount of time. Again, I get it, you want to listen to the public. If we told them no, and we didn't have public comment on our regular meetings, wouldn't be on this board. Their public comment is not mandated, but it is in policy and expectation. Regular meetings, not really special meetings like this. I bet you wasn't on the agenda for tonight, right? That's rightly so. But again, there is a window and an expectation I would have to have a cheat sheet of sorts, maybe I'll get what was done in some other counties and send it, for the future. But those big fires come along, some days going on, and your superintendent's gonna put that fire out with working, and it's like, sorry, it's right. Sometimes it don't happen.
How we handle it with people calling us, we say, you know, talk to your superintendent, talk to your principal.
That's in the chain of command.
Yeah.
And I think you gotta recognize that chain of command, that chain of command is successful, you're gonna hold someone accountable. You know that, right? Because if we're gonna tell these folks to follow, you know, tell an individual comes up and follow the chain of command, well, that person's gonna leave, talking to you, be upset, like, what do you work? So there's an expectation that that chain is followed by field administration, superintendent, and what have you.
What if part of the delegation, someone makes a statement about someone individual as a, like an employee of the school, name by name, and or a student or someone in the community. In terms of the employee, I think the ethics commission says that that is to an extent allowed. Like if you say, I don't like how the principal of this school did this, then I think to an extent that's allowable. But practically, is there any other way to handle things like that? In other words, someone complains about an individual student.
Yeah.
Or a teacher.
And I think in that regard, it makes it difficult for one person. He's elected to be what?
He corrects traffic.
You're the board president, and there are times when someone goes outside the scope of that public policy, probably has some language in there about what those limitations are on public comment. And it's in the way that you need to do that, there are times when it has to be shut down.
Well,
I hope it doesn't get to that.
I think we could just come up in a meeting. You know, I can inform them, now you can't, we don't want to hear names. You know, I can tell them that, but if they go up that side, that's go, we can't control what they're saying.
Yeah.
So, I have that.
I think the ethics commission says that.
Yeah, so, you know, say Jason comes in and he says, you know, and I'll just pick Frosty. Frosty is a football coach in another high school. He's not treating my child right now, wants him to be going, you know, I can say, you can't mention any names.
Yeah.
But if he goes on to say how bad Coach Frosty is, and then that's on him at that point.
Yeah, you can call him, you can name back, you forgot, whatever. But young people will not stop.
No, they right upset, so they want to go ahead
And streaming may take care of that, because everything you say is now streamed. I don't know if it's taking care of that.
But I can only tell them.
That's kind of
I can't control.
And that might be something to put on that paper, you know, if you have a statement you wish to make about a specific situation, beware that, you know, make it as general as possible, something like that. That could be on my handout, you get people to know about your names, that may work.
And again, it's not uncommon for superintendents when they see those public comments and people signed up to maybe talk with that person a few minutes in advance and say, is this really the form, if you want to talk, if you want to come in and be tomorrow, for example.
That's a very good.
Right, versus broadcast out, you all in a tough situation, our staff, that people just want to be heard, right? So if they're in front of you folks, they feel like they've not been heard if they've gotten to this point. I know in your read through in terms of, in my world, from the legal counsel standpoint, in your factual scenario, it's that individuals are reaching out to legal counsel,
Yeah.
right? So my role is I represent the board.
Yes, correct.
I see you all, you know, oftentimes in counties, they think that represent the superintendent, or I'm beholden to the superintendent. At the end of the day, my advice and decisions are based upon the 5 board members. That is the client. It just happens to be secretary to the board is always my point of contact. That doesn't mean on a occasion that I don't get a phone call from a board president on something. I can tell you, I can count that often. My fingers in terms of throughout the year, a contact from the board president, maybe on an agenda item or something to that effect. Or maybe the board has directed another board member to be the spokesperson, and reach out on some sort of specific topic they may be more inclined to. But otherwise, I don't get the phone calls from those folks or anyone else. I feel like that's been a pretty good understanding of folks throughout the state, our board members, because otherwise, board members should understand the framework you're personally responsible for. You know,
Yeah, and one of the questions I actually asked the commission, it's not something they can answer, but the attorney basically said, if you get private, counsel, don't try to present the bill forward.
Yeah.
Your counsel is it's big. So this superintendent did the right thing. They asked him to get counsel. He went right for counsel. And there's probably a procedure you have for that. He didn't work out and go say, well, I'll just hold on, it's 3 years. So a lot of times I think I'm really feel constrained of what we might pull from out. Really, it works to your advantage. If you follow the right procedures, the process, those policies in 000, you might want to read those. Some of them need to, Dr. Wood, you talk a little bit about bringing those up to date. Then you really have a good way to conduct a meeting that is efficient and it can be effective as well. It's when you go beyond formality and you don't understand it or you try to recreate it on the spot, like they did here in some of these things.
I hope I can find on the side. You've seen this board over the past number of months, right? And, we want this school system to be successful. Absolutely, that success is contingent upon, our superintendent, our board, us making sure we're following policy and procedure. You don't follow policy and procedure, when I give a legislative update today, there's an expectation that the state superintendent has to update our legislative oversight committee, and a lot of those updates are linked to individual counties or those individual counties following policies and procedures. There's an expectation that those are being followed, either like them or not. But, your superintendent has a boss who is who, I get it, to an extent, and it's also the state superintendent. These board members, and maybe I might be putting you on the spot, I've not been here to see or otherwise. Anything that we need to address with them specifically from our standpoint in terms of making sure we're on the right path of a good functioning board with a new superintendent?
I would just like to say, in a very sincere way, that I have seen lately tremendous growth, teamwork, collaboration, and process mindfulness, intentionality, and how to do things with the Board of Education and the central office that is going to benefit the citizenry and ultimately the children of Pocahontas County Schools, which is everything we do should be the focal point, the children, period. And I believe that ultimately the model that they are now setting for those children as to how to do things in a beautiful, messy, democratic society is on display. And honestly, I am thrilled, and I mean this sincerely, with the proactive leadership that I see here this evening. The fact that you all pulled this off and brought the capital THE, Howard O'Cole here this evening, and Jason Long, absolutely a paramount legal advisor, counsel to the board to lead this, and that you had the fearlessness to face yourselves. And a lot of these issues, as you well know, have been laid right there on that table throughout the past months. I think that's amazing on your part. Congratulations to you, and I mean that very sincerely. And they will tell you, Mr. Long, I've told them otherwise before. Things that they didn't necessarily want to hear, and I asked them, "You want me to talk to them?" And I did.
Yeah.
And so this is wonderful to see, and I'm so grateful.
We've got this mindset. these decisions in the best interest of students. I've always said if I was on the board, I'd like just write down on a sheet of paper and every time we're just kind of looking down, every decision we're talking about, everything we're doing, but everything to the side and set a decision. You're going to have some bumps in the road moving forward. We've got some vacancies that we need to fill. Your superintendent's working a lot of long hours. So again, you're on that strong path of success. Dr. Cole, what else have we had?
I think that covered most of those legal things. Some of these were not even really covered in the scenario if they come up in other counties. I guess one question is, when you get to personnel matters that are going to come up and you are going to have to take those up, I think they want to go in executive section to talk about it, people who will truly be affected. I think you cannot do that if I'm not mistaken.
So actually, the roadmap of that is, Mr. Brown was on the board or not. Dr. Ferris was here, he was on the board.
You weren't.
So remember Dr. Ferris?
Was the super.
Years recently. And I guess kind of the scenario there, for example, when we go into personnel season, it's not uncommon, for example, for the superintendent to give a board kind of a summary of what to expect. And in this county was so small, what happened there is Dr. Fair said, I don't know the facts to the extent that it was, let's say, if we're going to make a reduction to Spanish in the high school, well, how many Spanish teachers would there be? Well, it's only one because we're such a small county. So it led to agreements, among other things. It was upheld in terms of they didn't validate, but you really have to be cautious in terms of not being prejudged. Gives the overall picture, but have any discussion beforehand. Or that would be the easy thing, right? I look back at the last time I was here, the easy thing would have been for the superintendent to call each board member, say, are you going to support this? Right, and, that's not the right thing to do. One of the things I take very seriously, I think five board members would as well, is the rights of our employees. Right, we follow the code, and the code tells us that employees are entitled to a hearing in front of the board and not to be prejudged or. I take that serious. The superintendent usually makes recommendations, believes as board support, nothing really trying to work behind the scenes as it relates to that. So.
I guess one of the questions that came up here is they privately discussed how it's going to be political suicide. Now, when we say privately discuss, does that mean that somebody sent somebody an email, somebody sent someone else an email, and somebody sent someone else? Or did they just see someone as a board member bring it up? But I think the point about that is you really can't get in private discussions like that. You have to really wait till you're in a convened meeting. And as tough as that is, I think that's the right way to go because of, like, board members take that too strictly sometimes. Like some board members say, if a board member, someone in the system passes and they go to the few, we all be there at the same time. That's just behaving too.
That's like.
Yeah, it's making it.
What I can't have in this scenario is, let's say we're in a different county, because there's no school closures occurring here. Let's say we're in a different county, you three, on Sunday, go down to Shoney's and you talk about whether or not you are supporting the closure of school X, Y, or Z. Are we able to do that? No, and that has happened. But you historically go back and you look at Fayette County, where it started off with and how it ended. That was kind of the domino of an unfortunate history of Fayette, which is now, of course, been successful and great. But they went through a period of time where that first issue is what snowballed into a number of issues because the school closure process was invalidated because of, that the old Shoney's or whatever they run. But,
Well, let me ask you this question. Say, is putting on a Western School Board Association meeting at the Marriott in Charleston.
And we decide to go. Can three of us ride together?
all five of you can ride.
Yeah.
That's
There was a point when they said only two of you can go together.
Well,
But you're not conducting business.
you don't have to be.
Well, you don't know. I mean, enjoy the trip, enjoy the travel, kind of stay away from any discussion that relates to things that may come before the.
You can, I'm sorry, we're gonna discuss everything on the board.
So, don't about I think, yeah, those are things that we have the fear over, that you hear you can't do, you can't do, you can't do. And I'm glad to see Dr. call back in his current situation, in terms of his relationship with boards, a discussion that can have that positivity of, let's be a board that creates goals and expectations of the group, superintendent has his or her own goals that are created by, yeah, I think it's going to be good for the back habits. So, yeah, those things you hear.
What it takes. Going with us for the drive.
They travel together and save some money.
You hear that,
It's smoking from the truck. It's always raining. No, I'm starting into that.
We have police man bring you the bill, then we don't need it.
But yeah, I think you got a fiscally sound school system as well. You gotta keep that in mind as well. It's ever changing throughout the state. One of the issues that can create really difficult for any school systems out there. Yeah, it can come and go kind of quickly, but it's understanding you're in pretty good shape here. Projected, so that's awesome.
I guess one question too, if the superintendent, the stricter guy, he kept saying it's not in the CFP, it's not in the CEFP, you can't really think it alternately about it or anything like that. I think you can, but you have to realize there are certain things, certain documents, guide what you do. And so you can integrate things and change it, but I don't think you can easily change the CEFP unless you go to state, I think it's state board.
Yeah, state board.
So that may be the conversation that gets you to go to state board and see. if it's changed. So again, the last thing is, a lot of people are concerned about screening and things like that. That was not a law passed by the legislature, that was really a state policy. I don't think the legislature passed that law. They didn't, because the House of Delegates does not like streaming. They do now, they have audio streaming. But that was put in by state board in policy 2322, which is the main policy that governs county board. And so that's how we got that. And I did hear a board member say, well, we have no time to really talk to ourselves about any kind of issues, privately or anything like that. I think we do have through work sessions like this, it still is open. And I think that's where you talk about things that you want in the future to look at. You can do it candidly and things like that, but there is a study done by the Open People's Law in Florida that it says it constrains public interactions of boards and bodies. You just have to live with this. That's all I can say. I can't change that. You have to live with this. So maximize it, or optimize it, so you can really make it effective to have work sessions. You get paid now more than you've ever gotten paid before, and that's an acknowledgement of the kind of meetings and things you to really maximize your role.
And I think, if I'm on the board, you said CEFP. CEFP is our comprehensive education facilities plan. If I'm a board member, maybe tomorrow I'm reaching out to superintendent saying, send me our CEFP. It's something you've got to do every 10 years. It's pretty expensive.
Right.
Like, use that time on that board and educate yourself. Just don't think you got to rubber stamp everything. You just think there's a code book that's telling you to do that. It's not the case. And those of you who've been on the board for a number of years generally recognize that. Mr. McKnight, I don't think that there's nothing that you can do. Again, as board members, there's a lot of things, and policy that you can set in terms of an expectation that's facilitated through the superintendent and counselor.
Just having a candid conversation, one-on-one, with the superintendent, can help with that law.
If not, that's often where I reach out to superintendent. I know the past couple of weeks, there's been a few things like, did you talk with the board about that? Or she been in there otherwise, that again.
We've talked more than, I talked the last one, in a year.
But that's, you know, board members not close, and I understand she gets a lot of requests from a lot of folks.
Right.
You know, again, you know, you've got kind of unique ways to communicate with each individual person.
If it's true and false, you want to go through this, or did you, what we have?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, for the air, you got to drive back.
Well, this crew involves put together orientation involves, when you do orientation and you do this with one or two members, all of the things handed out in orientation, they really are great, good handouts, legal things, things of that nature. But I was trying to get more, a bit different, point members, so I put things through it all together. So we'll just throw these out and see what you all think. Are you a constitutional body? As a county? Yes or no? True, false?
I got two of them. I think.
No.
No.
You're created by the legislature.
You are more or less a legislative
Body created by the legislature to operate at the local level. You're not cited in the Constitution except indirectly, and that is in regard to no more than two members for one magisterial district. So you're not really a constitutional body like the state board or the legislature, the auditor, or whatever. So that's the response to that. The other one is,
And I think on that, if I may,
yes, sir.
I'm a believer in our public school systems. There is nothing bad involving that. I love the private school system. So when you hear talk about, you know, whether it's consolidated, otherwise other county boards, that doesn't take any sort of constitutional change. That's all right here.
And it used to be, you're right, it used to be that people said
said that you had to have a constitutional
change.
No, they can
Do that.
on the 286 on the first day of the section.
Yeah.
They
They won't. I don't think.
but, and there
There may be at some point
consolidation,
consolidation of services rather than consolidating county boards. Because one of the things you do as a board, and it kind of came up in here, you are a safety valve for them, okay? If people have questions about COVID, how many people came before the legislature? And how many people came before you during the COVID period and said, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? So I think a real thing you do is you provide a forum for people and to
express concerns and things, and that's a valuable goal to have. But then
there's this thing in law where some decisions are so important, they're not going to let you make it. That's a lot in the state. Even with that, you provide leeway and things like that. It's that actually,
all that is on the superintendent.
the superintendent can do prospecting.
If we put,
And what the superintendent can do is they show you leeway you have, but sometimes policies don't have leeway or laws. It's better just to say, well, we spent a lot of time talking about this, but let's go ahead and this go to some other area. But it really leads to the leadership of the superintendent, to lead the board to know if you have leeway and stuff like that.
so
Sometimes you do have leeways in policies, or you want to do it your own way without
getting around the policy.
So now the second question is, all these terms, it is true, they are interchangeable. County board, now local education agency is a term used for a school district or a county board. It's a federal term. It's only found essentially, it's maybe one or two other places involved, but it's mostly found in the finance section. But it is found in other sections of law. And then school district and county board are the same. State board in their policy says the county superintendent is CEO of the county school district. I don't say county board, whereas in law it says county board, but really, I don't know why they changed that, but it means the same here. So those terms are all interchangeable. Now, this 1945 study, us for around though. But this is called the Strayer report. Strayer, S-T-R-A-Y-E-R. And I'm not going to go a lot into that. Actually, the Strayer report is 900 pages.
It's long, and it had to be like, we're talking 19.
There's only one copy of that, and it's in the culture center. There's one in Harvard, some other places like that. This Strayer guy,
He was hired by the legislature.
contracted with the legislature, to study how effective we had gone from 396 independent magisterial districts to 55. Few other states had done that at that time, and he said it's really, really efficient. And then he went on to say that it's really efficient, but you have to remember that West Virginia, and this is his exact words, is a state system of education. We're not like Ohio. Kentucky has a little bit more flexibility. We are really a centralized system of education. Now, when you say centralized system, you really, what comes out of that is standardization. So Strayer got in things that might come out of that, standardizing the school aid formula. So one size fits, standardizing the school building part. So one size fits all. So, and then in my own bias, and I'm gonna be very blunt, what it really does, it creates a managerial level of superintendents who really don't know how to go beyond the managerial to be leaders, but they're really not encouraged to be leaders or entrepreneurial leaders. Now that's bias. This Dr. Welly or Dr. Wallinger, she probably would agree because she comes at it from an education system. But education really works together more as a unit. It can't really have a lot of entrepreneurs out. Just like this board didn't really need this guy on the board who's an entrepreneur. But my question becomes, who leads innovation? Who leads you to innovation? Does anybody lead you other than what you think you have to do with the state laws and rules?
Like this one board member said,
Hey, if I get down there and see you're comply,
but if you have a good superintendent and good,
that's willing to work together, you can use some of these flexibility codes. I'm going to send those to you, Dr. Williams, give to the board. You can use these laws to give you flexibility. There's one I'd like to mention when I'm taking time, but under the county commission laws, chapter 7, if you find that there's a rule you don't like, and it's also added an amendment to include the state board and county boards, you can try to eventually take that to the governor's office and have it changed. Now, how do you take that? It's in there. But there are other statutes that are far more flexibility, and I'm going to give that list to you to do that. So the Strayer did point that out, that it is a centralized system. And it actually works by the state board and the legislature kind of inviting you to do certain things as long as they do not conflict with the laws, rules, and regulations. So by invitation, you can do the things that are enumerated, but it takes a good superintendent leadership to find what those are. And a board is willing to actually accept the fact there are some things it's just better for return on investment. You don't need to worry. Like this new discipline policy, I think state level, that's a blessing for you all, because it's laid out. That's part of the centralized way of looking at things. And then, now, so there is a way, but it's invited. I use the word invitation. It's by invitation. If we want to have it, we'll say you can have it. It's basically what and who can disagree with that? If you look at our laws, look at these laws. When I first started working in the organization, I probably told for that. That's a long time ago. And I don't see this really changing. Okay. So after the summers, if you read Western education history or the history of the state, they really put it out.
we went to the county union system in 1933.
The reason we did that was during the Depression, people were losing their homes and everything. So the legislature in West Virginia in 1933, they created the first tax limitation section, because most of our taxation is done by law and everything. And so that's why California had Proposition 13. But he makes something that goes along this way. He says, or they say, history scholars, that the county unit system didn't have to come into being at all. It could have been all directly at the state level, like Hawaii is the unit rural system. And the audit done in 2012, our school system said we're second only to Hawaii as far as all the rules and regulations. So they came up and said, they pointed out that the county unit system, 55 county boards, is compromised between people who want a greater state control and people who want a greater local. So you're in the middle. Not that you don't know that. You're kind of in the middle. public expects this out of you, and you can't say, it's so hard to explain the things you can't do. You know, like in other words, you don't have, public expects you to be able to do things that you know by law cannot do. And it's hard to explain to them you can't do this because they see you as a superintendent, that's one view. So that's sort of what they're saying here. Now this is true number 5 here. It used to be that school boards were considered the darkest islands of American politics. Nobody really knew what they did. Nobody really cared. Now, can you say that about school boards today? Why are you being straight? Somebody wants to know what you're doing. You're that important that someone wants to see your meetings, maybe to see if you make a mistake or something they can cite it. But I don't think it's that. I think that when you get to public bodies and institutions, you are very close to the people. And that's something that the stratified agencies and regulatory agencies don't like because you're elected. They can't put it in a quantified compliance. So that's why I think they have trouble sometimes saying that you're a legislative body at the local level. You're not a regulatory body like the state board that has very stratified meetings. Now, that doesn't mean you need to hop up and down and have the bad important meetings, although I might point out that the legislature has had people who jump up and down on their podiums and things like that. They're a legislative body. If they were reporting that, I don't know that it would be considered good form or good culture. But that's, so what I'm saying is that there is an intense interest in this state. I've never seen this before, that everyone wants to know exactly what they're doing. I don't know the reason, but I just play along, make it your advantage. Do the good things in your meetings, go down and know your meetings, know your stuff, and maybe a bit more. I don't know. Okay.
But that's my own bias, certain promotions.
Now, boards of education have a little leeway and flexibility. We've already talked about that. It's finding it, it's having a leader and a leader that will help you see flexibility. Prospecting is what I call it. And a board that is really wanting that. When some boards really don't want that, it's easier to abide by state law and compliance and say the state made it so. Because when you go out on that limb and you get flexibility, you're going out of 55 and doing that, and all the attention will be to you.
That's what the superintendent.
Scenario said, what's the return on investment of this? We'd be the only bunch of people doing this, the only board doing this. But sometimes that might fit your board back. So it takes leadership to be able to do that. And monitoring oversight. We're going to be taking this up either in November or at the winter conference. Now, the winter conference, for some reason, was set in Morgantown. I don't know why that. But the way we're going to do that is we're going to have a meeting in Morgantown, and then we're going to stream it live to all quadrants and superintendent quadrants. So, in other words, if you don't want to go to Morgantown, you'll get the meeting streamed too. And the department has a grant they give us each 2 years for training. We're going to try to do it that way. And I'd like to take up the issue of monitoring oversight at that meeting, because that is the way that by getting data and telling the superintendent what you want to know about and how you want the data delivered to you, which is in 18.4.10, which is about superintendent role. And it's also in 18.5.14 school board effectiveness. So in other words, you might say, we want to know how academic achievement is going in the district, and these are the specific things we want you to bring to us. In other words, we want to know the ins and outs, or finances might be a better example. Every 4 months, give us a report on where we're headed. Don't have the treasurer rewrite it. You give us a report, and then if you have questions, then they would be referred to the treasurer. So that's your superintendent articulate to you as your CEO, secretary, that in this case, she knows where you're headed. Because I didn't have to this one. So, and that puts the superintendent in a good position of leadership, because she, in other words, superintendent will be saying, okay, based on what our central office has done and our projections, I'm articulating to you as your leader and superintendent president, as your leader, this is where we're headed. And so that way then the state comes in and says you never knew any of these things,
Because you can never know all the things.
you will never, Boone County could never have known, people who go to jail, how would Boone County ever have known that? Unless somebody whispered it to them. So this gets you in monitoring oversight is not, it's a big word for saying, these are parameters, these are our system, these are special reports we want to know. Here's the calendar of those, here's the meetings we want those brought up. And then you're in the driver's seat of getting information and you're not left out in the cold. Because some of these people apparently were just left out in the cold.
And I would say, don't hesitate and feel embarrassed to say you don't understand something that maybe Sarah did, because I would. It's a, like, I'm even broken down in terms of,
Right.
hey, help me out here, tell me, you know, maybe an expense or otherwise, because the spreadsheets, I mean, you know, the average person, unless they're in that world often, I just think of it from a personnel standpoint, but again, don't ever hesitate to say, you know what, you give this to us every week, you kind of rush through it. You slow down here a little bit and make sure I understand where we're at and where we're at next year projected or things in that.
If you did that quarterly, you would be able to check and see if you're moving through the year like it's been. Another thing too is, I heard about this guy one time, he was in data processing, he didn't really like his job. He wanted to get fired at CAMC hospital there. So what he did was, he just brought in board records, 800 sheets of paper, this is my, okay? Well, that seems to me like what you sometimes get, you know, sometimes the bills and things are, so you need to have a way. It won't be a violation of state board policy, say simplifies this to us this way. And I think the treasurers would be glad to do that and count and board officials would be glad to do that, because it actually would give you more ownership of it and more direction of owning what you, now these bills, another thing is cited, how many people could look at all Kanawha County's bills they pay if they were under state office audit? I look at all the bills, Kanawha County Board, I mean, it would take trust. How would you know? And is it okay if you ask, well, what's wrong with that?
We do.
Well, you know, I don't understand some of these reports because that's your fiduciary, they call it fiduciary responsibility. In the end, you're liable for it to be taken over, so find out what's going on financially and get some reports that are more simplified and get a quarter projection. Then I think Rowan County was been maybe on the right path, but again, they got all their information from those on the deficit. So anyway, that oversight monitoring are big words for, hey, we want to know what's going on in the system, and we want some reports about it. Us, and here's what we would like the superintendent to do, and that should be up to him and her as the administration, then to bring you those reports. And I think a lot of boards don't do that because a lot of board members may not want all that information, or it takes a different form of agenda, as we pointed out. Of course, we already talked about the only employee, never say you're superintendent. And we were doing these policies, so Mercer County, I was shocked when board members think, well, the superintendent's our only employee. No, that is not the superintendent. They'll never get into that scenario because you say the county board elected the superintendent and very much is like you say appointed. So now it says appointed, but it used to be you were elected by the public and you weren't elected the superintendent who used to be elected by the public by the Constitution. So again, never consider your superintendent as your own employee. CEO of the board, we've already talked about number 9, number 10, school district instructional leader. Now that's very important because what happens here is I went to a county board recently and they've got a new superintendent and they said, he really knows academics, but he knows nothing about the finances. So now think about this in the environmental and that. So they've got to really have strong financial leadership they can trust. So that's important here because even though superintendent, what if my forte was finances but not instruction? But I have hopefully people on my office, like somebody didn't get a superintendent that's in Kanawha County because he didn't know enough the board to, when they interviewed him about special ed. They have about 20 people working special ed. Couldn't he rely on those people? They didn't hire him, but they used that word. He didn't know about the. So that's some of the things here that kind of come up. Now, is the superintendent the only one who can make a recommendation to you for an action item? Now, personnel, we know for sure, but if it's just a regular item, does the superintendent does it have to come from the superintendent, or are there things that you can actually recommend without the superintendent's?
Both Rice has a list of those.
Got the orientation, I can send you back out. But I think, again, getting back to what we were saying, probably it would be better if, like in most agendas, I hereby recommend, we recommend this. Then the CEO, it's though they were doing this,
But there are things,
let's not get into that.
let's do the things easy, and if you need flexibility, that's not fair. If you need flexibility, maybe that, yeah.
It's certainly for personnel, but there are areas you can make your own. But I think the answer to that is, it is true, the county board is almost solely responsible for making recommendations. And they're better off that, both the CEO and the secretary.
So I think that would be true.
Now, again, number 12 does answer what I guess I'm speaking. Number 12 does answer. There are certain things that you can make recommendations about, but for the purpose of the quorum, that nature, I think it's better to have a superintendent. And most agendas already say that anyway. Then something like that.
Then you, personnel, we've already talked about that, that's brought up your board here.
You, as a board, can decline a recommendation. And I think, Jason, as it's been pointed out by the ethics, by the grievance procedure and administrative law, you better have a very good reason for not accepting the recommendation. You could deny the recommendation. So if you deny it just because you don't want the recommendation, you may be able to.
But the superintendent,
What we did in commercial sometimes was, we said, if you bring us a recommendation as superintendent,
then you are saying,
to us, you checked all this person's credentials, you know, they're certified, you know, they don't have any background detail you need to know about it.
and so when you vote on them, you're voting to go, the superintendent said, oh, this person is completely clean, nothing, you know. And I think that's a measure of flexibility.
Now, that's going to be part of the personnel.
But
Work on that, because I think kind of a compromise there, because that really bring accountability to that recommendation. But again, it's like a lot of things, what is return on investment? So, and I don't know, most boards do basically put faith in the superintendent to know recommendations are okay, because they're actually done by personnel office, probably.
They were not in this county. They were, the superintendent and Ms. Barkley were functioning as personnel. But the superintendent, the new superintendent's looking to hire a director of personnel and human resources. So that's a good growth point. But the board ultimately has supported superintendent's recommendation for personnel.
Down to, if your superintendent has a good working relationship with her board, she's gonna have kind of a gut feeling of how the board feels about candidates. And she's not gonna bring a recommendation that board members don't vote for one right, whether you vote there or not. Look at it.
And I like to follow up on that. You know, we have a training section called stay in lane. Well, okay, that's how stay in lane. It's like talk to a talk. What you're really talking about is that the longer you stay as a superintendent, more expectations that's what you talk. The board will have a view that you can trust your leadership. And then the greater amount of trust you give along the pipe as you go down the pipe, then the more that it becomes a collaborative and collegial relationship. I have never known a board that got off on the saying, stay in your lane, and the superintendent saying, stay in your lane. I mean, that's on our program. I hope that's one of those things, those phrases you like to just have embrace, but because it does not allow, it doesn't take consideration that as you work together with, and you have to put up a lot sometimes, you'll make mistakes and they'll make mistakes, but don't haul off and get a new superintendent, because that's really where you get in trouble sometimes. So I think it's really a relationship developed over time, and the more it develops, sometimes the superintendent will sort of get into policy. And sometimes the board will sort of get into, hey, look, HV, fixed for 15 years. We're sorry for the excuses. That's what I mean. You can't go with this strict stay in your lane stuff.
Because it's gonna leave them for
Have any relationship.
Next thing there is that
LSICs, they do have a powerful role. They were really created as a means to get local involvement. They never really reached their potential. They have a tremendous amount of potential. But what would you expect? They really are, but they don't get any fee, no monetary compensation, big dollars or anything. They're all volunteer. They really don't know what they are to do. They're often led by principals, and even though they're not, they have other people on the LSICs. I think this is an area, if we're going to build public trust and public education, we've got to really develop people at the local level who can speak well of schools. And let the LSICs do that. Tell them this is your role. Go out in the community, see what's going on in the school, things you may want to change or not want to change. So they have a lot of potential. When you talk to legislators about LSICs, they don't know what the acronym means, and then when you explain it, it's all explained as, well, they're not doing a very good job, they're not doing it. Well, that's up to the board. The board has no control over LSICs in the sense that they report to you, they do report to you, but be sure they're appointed, have that as one of your colleagues that you get over a monitoring oversight, has our LSICs, have they been appointed? Do they know? And then they do have somebody do some training like that for them. And then county boards, you can optimize your effectiveness in 1918-514. That's school board effectiveness statute. It gives you every leeway in the world to do a lot of things that have never been done, because it takes a lot of prospecting to go out and do those things, and monitoring oversight of mentioning those. Then of course we have the idea that the state board does have supervisory power over school boards. Actually, the state superintendent is the only official who can remove the school board member. It's under 18.3 or 3. It's one of the 86. State superintendent can actually remove school board members. Says school laws. And that would probably be the school board member, principal, or anyone else. I'm sure the state superintendent would really be wanting to do that. So we do have a process we got into where intervention is really a process where a legislature that created the county board as a local legislative body then vacate your role and they bring someone else in to control your district, and then you're elected, but you can only do what you're allowed to do, permitted to do. It puts you in a terrible life.
Yeah.
Because the people in your counties, they may not understand that, but how many people
when take over counties really protest there until
your law does this? And so my main message would be never get yourself in that position.
Yeah.
You know, do everything you can to be preventative, like you're doing tonight, or you can do the oversight.
so you have a pretty good handle on the system.
Now, some people think interventions are political, the state board says they're not, and so we have to trust them, they're not political. Really, when you read them, those reports, a lot of those reports point out things that board members have learned in training. State board says they didn't work it because they're not doing it, so it's not really effective or something like that. That's part of the oversight, I believe. But because training done in Charleston at the Marriott developed done like the Ira different things. So we have this program on the agenda about special ed, 1 hour to learn about special ed. Well, okay, that's one. So we're going to get quadrants, and we're going to have special ed directors work with the board members to have training in quadrants, so they'll know a little bit more what to ask about special ed. So that's getting into monitoring and compliance and things like that. And then, yeah, we've already talked about the audit. Last thing is there is a provisional law in the calendar that says the primary purpose of the school district is to provide instruction. They don't say to students, or they don't say it's to provide instruction. But then this next
Through the considerations, and I think it's the last page we have, it puts all
things, the
what
role
would you have?
it tries to say
one is more important than the other. I don't know if any of you put like one to 10. But my advice if you do that is, in one point, that all is correct, your primary purpose of the school district, meaning the county order, would be instruction. But then you also have a primary role of being fiduciary responsibility. You have a primary role in academics to help accountable for that. So these things cannot be struck, they cannot be rated. In my own mind, you just have to figure out, hey, it is for you. And that's the best way I think to look at it, because you have to do all of these things. Now, I did go to one meeting where we were talking to the newly elected member, and she wrote about it, and she came up with that statement of instruction. First, she was a former teacher, so she thought that was the first thing she went right on down the line. But it really is not that simple, because Mr. Throckmorton, the board president, said it's really never that simple. But you have to do all these things, and getting old psychometry, data collection, things like that will help you do it stronger. And the last question, or the last theory question is, when do you know your board's back? When do you know as a board your board's back?
You don't hear a lot of complaining.
One reason. That is one. Does that mean that people are proud and happy with the board, or you just really haven't hit a nerve?
Academically,
Yeah, you're right. Well, effective means, yeah, and I think this question is kind of hard to answer, because you may know you're effective, but some nerves hit, like I said, then people think you're ineffective. So, but I think academic standard, and this school board, kind of scenario, they refer to mistaken academics, like we're a small school, they refer to mistake. So one thing is really academic achievement would be one, be good fiscal data, getting yourself not in fiscal trouble, things like that to show that you're effective, and really engaging with your community.
Yeah.
One of the things the streaming's done is makes it almost impossible to take some of your meetings outside the schools, so you can't visit your schools sometimes. And that is something that people have been mentioning about that. And then how do you know when you're ready? Well, I guess for taking hold, that's one thing.
Because you're not complaining.
You hear, and, you hear complaints about decisions you've made, and then you have to think, really, could we have done this differently? And then the Mingo County Board was cited for following Robert Rules order for a large group, and they were deeming for reconsideration, had to be on the majority at a meeting. Like, actually, you can reconsider things that you can use their terms of that. So you can change course sometimes. Now, if you're in the middle of the building can't say, well, now we don't want the building. Okay, but there are certain flexibilities you have to think about those. And then this is the county board's true constituent is the student. True or false?
Yeah, I got true.
It is true, that's under policy governance. You get very nexus or the very core of who you're working with. It is your students, and you're going to see the student in a different way than your teachers will, your administrators, and others, but the board is superintendent. So your student is your students. It's not the voters. It's not WDEA and AFT. It's none of those groups. They fit in, but they're not the true constituents. That's bias. I learned that from Johnny Carter, who taught policy governance. And then we got some other questions here.
I guess that could be constituent.
Yeah, the staff would be a constituent group. Yeah, they're gonna have all kinds of constituents. When we did commercial county policies, we call county board or county school district constituents. And it's a lot of people, because at certain times, benefits will be a constituent, certain times healthcare will be a constituent. Then we talked about this already, never think stay in your lane, that's what they did, bigger about question number 17. Number 18, the role of school system is to provide instruction to students. I think we've covered that enough. You can't just isolate one thing. Controlling and the management of the school system in 1880 or 1830. How do you control and manage the school system? After all, you can't be controlling and managing if that's you're not managing. So you do it through policy and through the superintendent. Exactly right. That's how you control and manage. You go out. You do not go out and develop your own ways of doing things, your own investigations, things like that. Then
For the county board to progress, the county board must act on all things you hear when people come before the board of delegations. That's true. What if you did that? How would you be, what if you had two groups that came before you hyper responsive, you couldn't figure out which one to act? So you can, taking delegations and getting comments from delegations is that part where the public comes to you with something, but that doesn't mean you have to do it. Some things they might do it, but they're creating, work at it. So then, usually when we do this orientation, identify some of the reasons you ran from school. We do that right on the side. Well, that, and these is orientation. Then you get into things, then you have all these things that come up with the environment you can't control. You ever think, why did I do this? You do, but really, you're doing it because of your true decisions. We've already talked about. And you're elected by the public. It's a transactional thing. They elect you to do certain things that they like you have the ability and directives. So it's very honorable. There are more school board members as elected officials than any other group of the state. Think about that. And you don't have a cloud of maybe political bodies that are partisan, but you also don't activate the cloud you do have sometimes by getting people involved. Because when Kanawha County closed all the schools in the eastern end of the county, that's when people started worrying about the school closing because their kids would have to drive, be great, a little bit farther. Get it so the schools stay open because they care about the people open. But then you have to have a school aid formula that rewards you in this. That's the list.
Okay, well, I would like to thank Mr. McCall and Mr. Long for coming and doing this training for us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Howard, it's good to see you again, buddy.
Thank you. Now, in terms of follow-up, I think what we really want to do is I want to get you some material that I said a moment ago. And then if you want to have a meeting to see where you are in a few months, we can do that. If that's something the board suggests, it's not something Jason suggests. If you want that, we can try and see where things are. But I think there's Mrs. Klein keeps you relevant. I don't think so.
And Jason, thanks for all the help you give me. It's very much thing to the board. Help. And Lincoln, Holly, helped us get through it.
And you have to have her.
Yeah.
If you cannot do that.
No.
Howard, it is good to see you back.
It really is.
We've had fun, and that's what makes it in on that.
Under new reports, we got discussion, review, and possible action on the 2025 and 2026 fundraiser. You,
Yes, it is. So I want to talk to you a little bit about fundraising, and I do have this list of topics attached for the fundraisers. However, I wanted to talk about, get this list, and this is a list of topics that you approve, that you say, okay, we are really doing these types of fundraising in our school system. But if we go to our state policy, there are some guidelines that we have to have fundraising. So a fundraiser has to be generated at the school level by a person or individual that is associated with the school. So I'm just going to read you what it says. It says fundraising activities must be covered by our liability insurance. The school board's commercial general liability policy through the Board of Risk and Insurance Management branch generally includes election and appointment of officials, and that's faculty members, employees, volunteers, and student teachers acting within the scope of their duties, regardless of whether they're on school grounds. Volunteers must be acting on behalf of the school board and not a separate entity. So what that means is and then it goes on to say, therefore, volunteers working for a school support organization with a separate FIN number or an IRS 501c3 status may not be covered by the school board's policy but volunteers working for the school support organization that is not a separate legal entity and runs their funds through the school system. So when it comes to regulating fundraisers that have specific names on them of an athletic team or school organization, those funds have to be run through our school organization to be covered by our insurance.
Insurance.
So why is that important? So let's say hypothetically, because I remember this happening one time, we get $10,000 worth of candy bars. Okay? And we're an organization out there saying we're selling this for the school system and we support it. And then they don't give that merchandise out or they consume that merchandise. They're not covered by our insurance because they have a separate account, right? But they're representing us. So we really got to think about that process. In addition to that, we have a list on here of topics we're going to improve. We agree with having these topics as fundraisers in our system. But you still have to, by state code, by state policy and by our policy, and our policy says that it has to be, we have to know the dates, the times, it has to be assigned of the person leading it has to submit the form, the request, the principal has to sign it, and the board has to approve it. So even though we're approving these topics tonight, everybody that's doing a fundraiser has to submit a fundraising form for the board. So really all this fundraising topic form that we're approving, and I don't know where this originated, and I will continue to do this for you, but it doesn't approve everybody doing fundraisers. They have to submit a form. So if somebody wants to do a bake sale, whoever's doing the bake sale submits the fundraiser to the school principal, the times and the dates and the locations they're going to do the bake sale. The principal signs that fundraiser, they send it up, we approve it, and I put it on the agenda for you to approve. So we have to have that form process, and that's in our policy 1224.1. There's an example form in there that they have to use. Now, we have a form, and here's what I think's happened. I think over time, maybe that process and procedure of using the form has been eroded away a little tiny bit. But we gotta have that form submitted. Just for liability insurance, just to keep, as per our conversation tonight, to keep you informed and control of what's going on with that. So you can vote to approve the fundraisers at the bottom of the fundraiser, and I didn't bring mine, and I see that, now, Morgan has his. Can you read what's on the very bottom of that form for me?
Right,
Yeah.
all sales must follow with the BEA policy 432. Bingo and or raffles will be handled on a one-to-one basis. License and other supporting documentations are to be submitted to the central office before approval will be considered.
Yes, so we've had a couple of raffles come up. And there is a charitable gaming license that you must have to do a raffle. You have to have that charitable gaming license. I do not feel like, as your superintendent, it's my responsibility to micromanage getting that license. If somebody needs it, I will delegate that to Ms. Hamilton to assist them in getting the license. But they do have to submit that because code also says somebody has to be responsible for taxes. So we have to make sure that we are responsible for taxes. We have to just make sure that we have everything spelled out appropriately. And then I'll bring it to you, and I'll bring every single fundraiser request submitted to me to you in a timely fashion for you to make the decision on. But we just have to have that process. And there may be one that you don't want to do. There may be one that you, that somebody asked you about, but if we could just please say, you know, we have a fundraising form. Could you please submit that through the appropriate channels? I promise you I will get it on the agenda. Now, there has been some problems with trying to get something on the agenda after the agenda goes out. So I want to communicate that to our staff, that the agenda goes out the Thursday before our meeting. And if you want something on that agenda, you need to get it to me by 3 o'clock the Thursday before the meeting, so I can get it on there and get it approved for you. Because I'm not going to approve things that haven't been gotten to me to get on the agenda in time. So,
Just 3 o'clock, give you enough time.
well, we have to get it out by 4, so I'll take it to the very last hour.
Okay, so if you want more.
I mean, I want to be as fair and as diplomatic as possible. Ollie and I work on that agenda. We are working all day, talking backwards and forth, emailing backwards and forth. We have a shared document. But I do want people to have time, but we have to set some guidelines. And I'm going to speak with the principals that it's their responsibility to say, I'm signing this, but didn't get it in time for the agenda. So it won't, for the next time, you may have to adjust your dates. We want to empower our school leadership, and we want them to be making those decisions, not calling up and saying, on Saturday, hey, I didn't make it on the agenda. I want to do this on Monday. Yeah, we go, you know, because we really are trying to establish some process and procedures. So I do want to open it up for discussion. Any questions for me or any questions for Sarah, Ms. Hamilton on this topic of fundraisers and the process or any policy related to that?
No, and thank you for your clarification.
All right, so we will send a memo out to the principals and start this process and get it in place so that we are following our own policy and what is required.
Who holds the answer? They probably should have this, because a lot of it is athletics. It's the biggest majority of it. So they should get
Yes.
that.
Yes, and I will
It's not the principal.
convey that to because ultimately the athletic directors are directly supervised and report to and evaluated by the principal. So if an athletic director does not know, then I feel like it is the principal who has not correctly communicated that. Would that be fair to you? Okay, but you can vote on the list of topics if you would like to.
The example of that would be the third page in that where Mrs. Stocky turned in a fundraiser form. And that's what you all will be receiving.
And that's what all the policies say that you are to receive. I like the list, but the list isn't, I don't even know, it doesn't adhere to any policy that is state policy or local policy.
Anybody read over the list?
Excuse me?
Everybody read over the list of the fundraising and work?
The list and the Scott G.
Yes.
Yes. All those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. Now we're going to superintendent update.
I do have a couple of updates. We have made, progress with our special education. I have spoken with Miss Hazel at the West Virginia Board of Education via email throughout the week. I submitted our plan, what we're gonna do and how we're gonna do it, and I received an email back from her that this evening. That's a great plan moving forward, and she's very excited about it. Additionally, I have secured 2 presenters I've started the process of securing, I just gotta get the paperwork in place. 2 presenters for the opening day of school on August 28th. We're gonna have 1 presenter. His name is Larry Bell, and he's gonna talk about the power of relationships and learning and vocabulary words that sometimes our students don't have access to, that prevents them from excelling in achievement. And he has a very powerful message that he delivers. I've also worked with Solution Tree today, and for Senate Bill 199, which is about discipline. And I think Mr. O'Call referred to that. I have secured a presenter that will cover that regulatory assignment that we have. But that is going to really focus on our overall agenda of having relationships with students, having high expectations that are consistent from classroom to classroom and from school to school, so that students have one expectation and they don't have to learn multiple expectations. Sometimes when we have individual little pods of expectations, it's hard for students to comply to them. So a universally communicated message to our students and to our parents and to our community. And I'm really excited about that.
Okay. Members' remarks, Mr.
I'm just really happy. And just fundraising things make something else. When I was an employee, we submitted travel requests to, I had to do it like I continue to add the water to it. It had to be in, it had to be board approved before. Since I've been on board, I haven't seen, I don't know if that was policy, but that seems to have went away. And people just go to conferences, I guess the superintendent approves it, but the board members never know.
That's next on my list. It's already on my radar. I've already talked to Ms. Hamilton about the travel process. I've started asking for those. I went over forms my first day. I think that form needs to be revamped. And you're absolutely correct. That should be something that the travel request should be coming through the board. I have pulled our policy to see what's in the policy for doing that. And as soon as I get that kind of lined out, we will start that process. So yes, it's on my list.
It just caught my eye. This ain't this.
No, we should be doing it.
You know, we don't see trouble until we get paid for it. Or it shows that they got paid for the training.
Collinsworth.
No.
Mr. Gibson.
This roll call is an extraordinary human being. That guy is, I wish that he would have came here 6 years ago when I first started this, because I mean, I would have clarified a lot of things. And I think he brought us a lot of things to me tonight, for us. And, and clarify those things. I like Morgan's I like the way things are going too. I really like the way things are going right now. I think it's good. And that's all I have for you, man.
Mr. McNabb.
Just like I said, mention same stuff. I didn't agree. I wrote a lot. And have to go. Knock him down.
I got a question. Anybody takers of the vice principal, Pocahontas County High School System Principal?
We have had some applicants. We have not had any applicants that met all of the criteria listed on the job posting. We have reposted that. It will come back down, and any applicant that was on there that interviewed, we have said, please reapply, because we really have to search for the most qualified applicant because of the situation with our special education. We need a conglomerate of experiences. So we're working on that diligently to find someone who can meet our needs.
I'm noticing one that's 110% off. It's all the boxes.
I was just talking about Miss Hollingsworth, Dr. Hollingsworth with Miss Bond today. I said she led the county through a special ed situation before, and she has a lot of expertise.
You're the principal.
Well, she's been thinking before. She worked at the State Department. She's
I
exactly.
was ready to do earlier today.
You're right. Dr. Hollingsworth is fun when you're just over.
Mrs. Klein has always told us what a job. What a great job he was doing. But but she's not gonna take any credit for the job that she has done.
Betsy.
She is an amazing, basically what kind of person she is, and I said she has been a blessing. She's heard me say that, same thing that you all have heard me say. I don't know what we'd have done without you, but I'm super proud, glad that you are here.
Thank you. You all are amazing to work with. I haven't met Lazy yet. If Lazy's here, I haven't met him or her. And so I'm having fun. Now, if we can just convince Dr. Hollingsworth that it's fun to be in business.
Thanks too much alike. And back up some.
The only other thing, keep up the good work. You've done an amazing job. You've been here, Dr. Williams. We made us feel like we made it like a decision. And, we're happy to have you with us.
It's an honor.
Okay, our next board meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, August the fifth, 2025 at 6 o'clock p.m. at the Pocahontas County Board of Education Conference Room. We are adjourned.